Hello, everyone. This is Angela. And at some particular records from the Dawes Commission, the era of the Dawes enrollment process. This was a process that began in 1898 and closed for the first time in 1906, and then finally closed completely in 1914. But we talk about the Dawes rolls all the time. We talk about the final roll. We talk about an ancestor who had a roll number. But what does that really mean? First of all, there are numerous records, literally hundreds of thousands of pages that are part of the Dawes collection. And we're going to take a look at that. We're going to take a up close look at enrollment cards. There are many components or elements on those cards, and many people just focus on the name, maybe the age of an ancestor, and they're missing incredible clues about the family that are right there on that card. So come with me. I'm going to share my screen with you, and we're going to take a close look at some enrollment cards. And I hope that this will assist you in being able to expand your story about your family. So let's take a look and see what we're talking about here. So I am going to expand this. Hopefully you can see it now a little bit better. Okay, we're going to go up close with these enrollment cards, and we're going to look at cards from all five of the tribes. So what are we talking about? What is actually the Dawes roll itself? What's the purpose of it? And what's the content? What actually is there? Well, today, the Dawes roll is the base roll that is used for membership in five federally recognized tribes. Those five tribes being Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw Creek, and Seminole Nations. But what exactly is this roll? Well, this roll itself, or the final roll, is a collection of records created between 1898 and 1906, prior to Oklahoma statehood, and then final names were added and closed in 1914. So it's a collection of records collected between 1898 and 1914. The purpose was to find out who was eligible for land allotments before statehood. And one of the things that has to be said, and I will say it, that found within the Dawes records are records known as Freedmen rolls or Freedmen records, and they contain the largest collection of records documenting blended families, documenting Native and African American interconnected families. And there's no other collection outside of these records created in Indian Territory that really reflect these blended families like that. Now, the five tribes, I've already mentioned what they are: Cherokee Nation, Choctaw Nation, Chickasaw Nation, Muskogee Creek Nation, and the Seminole Nation, all of which are in Oklahoma. As I said also, they were created to determine the eligibility of the enrollees for land allotments. The enrollees had to have, and they had to prove that they had ties to Indian Territory and to these five tribes. They were not created for tribal membership. Again, it's all about the land, and it's very important that you remember that it was created to determine who was eligible to get land. And every person who's an enrollee, from the head of household to the infant in the house, was going to get a parcel of land. Now, the process was really to introduce a new concept of land ownership. Prior to that, the tribes owned the land in common. So this process was really redistributing the land to the same people who owned the land already, if that makes sense. In other words, as opposed to land being held in common, individuals were going to now get private parcels of land, individual parcels, which was something that was really not common in the territory prior to that time. So once this whole process ended, then the remaining acres, and there were millions of acres left, that would then be opened up for settlement for white settlers to come in and pave the way for statehood, which was an eventual result. In 1907, Oklahoma joined the Union. Oklahoma, the name itself, actually comes from two words in the Choctaw language, Oklahoma, meaning red man. And it is interesting because many people don't realize that Oklahoma joined the Union in the 20th century, whereas some people will say, oh, yeah, 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 they went to Oklahoma in the 1800s. No, they went to the territory in the 1800s, but the state of Oklahoma joined the Union in the early 20th century. So this whole Dawes process took more than 10 years to complete. There were interviews that were being conducted really all over the place. Muskogee was sort of where the heart of the action took place, but they did go to different communities, Ardmore, other parts of the territory where these interviews were being conducted. But a lot of things were still being handled out of the agency, the Indian agency in Muskogee. The process first ended, that first realm of interviews ended in 1906, but there were challenges that were being made and additional names were added, and it was closed finally in 1914, 7 years after statehood, in fact. But this entire process of determining eligibility was to determine then whose name would go upon a roll of eligible people. In other words, their names were enrolled, inscribed, added to this roll. They were not joining a tribe, which many people think that's what enrollment meant. No, it meant that their name was added to a roll of eligible recipients of land, because it's all about the land. They were already there and they were already a part of the tribe where they lived. Their names were simply enrolled, put on the roll according to their tribal origin. Now, there are categories to those roles. You already know what many of them are, of course. Those who were put on the roll as individuals by blood, freedmen, intermarried whites, minors, and newborns. And you'll see that frequently on even some of the cards. Now let's take a look at a Cherokee case or a Cherokee card. You're going to find the cards by blood. You're going to find them in all of these categories. You're going to find freedmen cards. You're going to find cards of intermarried whites. You're going to find the minors and the newborns. And sometimes those were used interchangeably. And then, of course, you even find the freedmen, minors, and newborns, and similar categories for the other five tribes. So let's take a look. Now, in this case, we see the case here of dirt thrower Van, who lived in the Flint district in the Cherokee Nation. This is a by blood card. You see Cherokee Nation, you see Cherokee roll, and you see lots of information that is inscribed there on the card, including the name of the father of each person in the household, the name of the mother, the district from which they came, their ages, their gender, and whether they were full blood, half blood, or whatever that mixture may have been. Well, it's a one-sided card. All of that information goes on that one card. When you come to a freedman card is double-sided, information on the front and on the back. So you see the names of individuals. This family happened to have lived in Lenape up in the Coascui district, and you see that information. Freedmen who had been enslaved in this particular case. This is a person who had been enslaved by Confederate General Stan Wadey, a Cherokee citizen. He was a slaveholder. On the back side of the card, you see the name of the father of the two people whose names were on the front of the card. So you see the names of the father, you see the names of who the owner was, the slaveholder was, of the father, and you see the name of the mother and who had enslaved the mother. So this is something that it's important. Many people don't realize when you're looking at the card, if your ancestors were freedmen, look on the back side, more information. The intermarried whites also had cards, and you can see it stamped at the top, citizens by intermarriage. And their card is pretty much identical except for the stamp that is there. And of course, this person lived in the Delaware district, and you have the same information. It is also a one-sided card. You have those who were Cherokee by blood. You see Cherokee Nation, Cherokee Roll. You see stamped above the word Cherokee minor. In other words, this is a person who was obviously not born at the time the other card was created, but this person was then added at a later time in 1906, towards the end of that first period, but they were placed on this card. Freedmen also had cards, minors and newborns, and you see both words, minor stamped up there. You also see newborn stamped on that card. The person lived in the Cherokee Nation up in Veneta, and you'll see that the newborn cards or the minors cards, they were also one-sided, but the parents of the children are listed, the name of the father, and the father who was a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. You even see the roll number, Freedman number 536, that you see that, and he's the father of all those children. Likewise with the mother, you see her name, and you see that she was also a citizen because her roll number is there. That's pointing you to their card. In fact, if you look right underneath that first set of names, you'll see for father's enrollment, see Cherokee card number FR 192. And the same with the mother, see the Freedman card number 706. So these cards are pointing you to other cards to go and get additional information on the family. But we're going to go a little bit closer with some of these Freeman cards, and hopefully you'll be able to see just a little bit more information and glean some other data. Now, we're looking at a card here from the Cherokee Nation. Some of you might recognize this name, Stick Ross. Stick Ross was one of four freedmen who at one point in time actually served on the tribal council in the Cherokee Nation. And you see that he lived in the Tahlequah area, and you see a lot of information about him. And thankfully, when Ancestry went to Fort Worth to copy, excuse me, to copy a lot of this information, they scanned them in color, which is just wonderful to see that. And of course, in this case, we can see drops of red ink or something that was being dropped. Hopefully it's not blood. I think it's red ink actually. But nevertheless, you get to see the actual document the way it appears. Now we see a Choctaw card, and you can see again, they're all in color, thankfully. And basically they look the same. You have that same information. If a person had been enslaved, you have the name of the slaveholder. We see Stick Ross. We see he was a slave of John Ross. That's Chief John Ross. You see Solomon James from the Choctaw Nation, and he was enslaved by a person called John Galvin. and so on. And you see tons of other information there. We're looking at Edmund Hamidi over here. Again, this is a Chickasaw card, but you see the rich data that's there. Here's a card, it's Peter Stidham from the Muskogee Creek Nation, information about him as well. And I know many people will look and say, oh, okay, you get their name, you get the roll number, and you know who their slaveholder is. And likewise, you have something similar coming from the Seminole Nation as well. We're looking at Titus Cudjoe, who lived in Sassacua, and you see the name of the person who had enslaved him as well. Now, in many cases, you're going to find someone who's much younger, who, now keep in mind, when did the Dawes era begin? 1898. So anyone who was over 35 generally is a person who could have been born enslaved. But it must be emphasized, one thing must be emphasized, every single person who was born in the territory before 1866, when the treaties that abolished slavery were signed, everybody was not necessarily enslaved. There were free people who were living, free people of color, free people of African descent who did live in Indian territory. And so it is important to know that not every single person was enslaved, but if they were of African descent, some of them still ended up on the freedmen roll anyway. But that's another discussion. But yes, that did happen. So we, as we go into these, as I said, they're double-sided. Here is this Cherokee card, and we get additional information. We see more information, for example, about Joseph Stick Ross. And we see information. His father was a man called Hector Ross. His mother's name was Sally Ross. Again, they were all enslaved by Chief John Ross. And there's still even more information. And of course, there are several people in the house. There are at least 7 people there. So, of course, on the back, the information on those first 7 lines on the back side reflect additional data reflecting the people who are on the front side of the card. But what else is there to find? There's a lot. The names, of course, the card number or the field number, the roll number of an individual, the slaveholder's name, the date of the application. Many people never look at the date. They don't know what date their ancestor appeared, and it's right there in front of them. Their previous enrollment, had they been enrolled on another card, had they been on a card from the 1880s or earlier or later, but that information is there. Are there any critical notes that are there? And how about the approval stamp? When did it become official that they were put on the roll to become eligible for parcels of land? Well, let's look at some of those components. We've already looked at Stick Ross. And of course, we see on the front his name, the name of his wife and children. We see his age. We see the gender of everyone who is there. In the upper right-hand corner of that card, you see a field number. Sometimes, and it really is almost, I won't say it's random because there was a pattern that some of the tribes use. Some prefer, I think in the Creek Nation, you see the field number more frequently, and in other nations, you'll see a card number and the field number is blank. It still doesn't matter because they become indexed by that number. If the card and the field number are filled in, usually Ancestry would index them by the card number. But it's still something you do want to pay attention to because when you're looking quickly, it helps you zoom in and find that card. You also see the roll number. Many people don't understand that the number that became their official roll number is right next to their name on the enrollment card. If you go to the page on the final roll, you'll see that same number next to their name. So it's very, very helpful. You find, of course, who the slaveholder was. In this case, John Ross for Stick Ross, but his wife Nancy had been enslaved by a man called David Rowe. So again, that information is very, very useful. At the bottom right hand corner, you see date of application for enrollment, April 10th, 1901. And many people don't necessarily see that at all times. But it is certainly helpful to have that information. If you're writing a small biography about Stick Ross and you can talk a bit about his life or maybe his time in the tribal council, but you want to say at some point in his life, April 10th, 1901, he appeared in front of commissioners of the Dawes Commission to have his name and that of his wife and children put on the roll to receive land allotments, and that was April 1901. But there's other information here. You see where it says tribal enrollment in that particular box. It tells you that, now, of course, if you look in the upper left-hand corner, you see he lived in Tahlequah. His post office was in Tahlequah. But look, in 1880, he was in the Saline district. He wasn't in Tahlequah. He was in the Saline district. But of course, you can tell by the time um, the children are being born, you start to notice, but they were in Tahlequah at one point in time. Notice the year. They were, in other words, they were on a town roll, Saline, in 1880, but by 1896, they were in Tahlequah because their names had been placed on a list of citizens in the Tahlequah district. So there is an 1896 roll that people aren't aware of. 1880 is particularly well known. Many people have heard of the authenticated 1880 census, and freedmen were placed on that roll as well. And it's telling you or pointing you to not only his name and that of his wife and children, it tells you what their roll number was on that roll from that particular year. You also get additional information if the name was spelled differently on an earlier roll. They tell you how it was written. They'll tell you what that roll number was from that particular year. And then you find critical notes. You find that there was a testimony that was made in July. It says, see the testimony of July the 8th, 1904. So you see some other things that are going to direct you to more data that you can find on that family. And of course, the approval stamp when the citizenship was actually authorized and was approved. So these components are very, very important. But each tribe is different. Each tribe had different traditions, different customs, and it was structured slightly differently, even though they were all put in similar looking cards. So let's take a look. In Cherokee cards, as we already looked at Stick Ross's, it reflects that there was an 1880 roll, but clearly there was an 1896 roll as well. And it tells you the number of every person on that previous roll. That's what that whole tribal enrollment means. The year, the district, and what their roll number was at that time. But it tells you, when it says the district, Saline District, Tahlequah, you need to learn your geography. So maps are important. Maps, I love maps anyway, but you really need to know, well, what were all of the districts in the Cherokee Nation? Find a good map. A simple Google search will help you pull up many of them. But you'll realize, wow, look at all of these different districts in the Cherokee Nation. And in the smaller map at the bottom, you see what's now the whole state of Oklahoma, and you see where the Cherokee Nation fits in. But you see the Canadian district, the Kewaskum district, Delaware, Flint, Going Snake, Illinois, Saline, Sequoia, Tahlequah. It's important to understand where they live within the boundaries of the nation that they were part of. In the Choctaw Nation, there were 3 primary districts and then some smaller areas within those districts. In those 3 districts, the Akwesasne district, Mushlatabi district, and Pushmataha. My ancestors happen to have lived in Mushlatabi district. Over to the right, you'll see Scullyville, which is where my ancestors lived. But each one of those communities had small towns. You had Oak Lodge, you had Brayton, you had Brazil, you had Fort Coffee. You have a lot of other communities that were there. Also in that same district, you had Cedar. Sorry, you had in Mushlatabi, you had Scullyville, you had Sugarloaf, Tabuski, Samboys, Gaines, and it's important to actually know what some of these communities consisted of. You also had, I had ancestors from the extreme southeastern part who lived in Eagle or Eagle Town, and they, excuse me, they weren't that far from Red River, from Tosin, from Wade, and other communities. Pushmataha, you want to know where your ancestors lived. Now, in the Chickasaw Nation, there were four major areas: Panola, Pickens, Pontotoc, and Tishomingo. But within those communities, there were towns. There was Berwyn, Wynnewood, Milo, all of these communities that were there, Stonewall, Ada, but you want to put it in some context. So you want to become as familiar as you can with those communities. In the Creek Nation, first of all, there's the tribal town structure, but it can be a little bit confusing. The tribal towns were not necessarily towns where people slept. It was a town to which you had membership in the sense that you belonged to a town. Now, some of the towns, the tribal towns that you see, and I went through the entire 1895 roll within the Creek Nation and wrote down every single tribal town. And 3 of those towns were freedmen towns: Arkansas, Canadian, and North Fork. You see them in red here. Now, I put the abbreviation because sometimes it appears on the documents. Arkansas Town was sometimes written as Arkansas Colored Town, Canadian Colored Town, and North Fork Colored Town. But they were official tribal towns within the confines of the Muscogee Creek Nation. Here's an example over to the right. You can actually see the town of Canadian, or as it says in the document, Canadian Colored Town. And these are online, they're digitized, they are on Ancestry. And of course, you can see the individuals. It's a handwritten document, but you see, of course, Sangos, you see, excuse me, Perrimans, you see Jacksons, Tuckers, and so on. So it is important to understand the structure of the nations from which your family comes. Now, in the Seminole Nation, it's very important. Freedmen lived in multiple communities, and I've gone through the Freedmen records and documented the different communities where they lived. And you can see they were all over the place. They were in Chuska, they were in Emachaka, Megasaki. I love saying some of those names, Sasakwa. And we woke up and you see them literally all over the area. But the structure of the population and the government in the Seminole Nation is by band, tribal band, freedmen bands, and we're going to talk about those in just a bit. In the Choctaw Nation, the same components are there. You see Solomon James up close under tribal enrollment. You see that they lived in Red River and they were on the 1896 roll, and it tells you what their roll number was from that 1896 document. And some of those notes at the bottom. And it tells you if there was any type of difference in their name, the way it had been written or spelled. then they put that down there. This person appeared on the 1896 roll as, and they write it out. So one can be clear. Here's a document from the Chickasaw Nation. And you're probably looking and saying, oh, there's nothing there on tribal enrollment, no previous rolls. Well, the Chickasaw Nation refused to adopt their former slaves, although when at the time when slavery was abolished, they agreed they would adopt them and give them citizenship and rights in their nation. They fought against this after signing the treaty to do so. They never adopted them, so their names do not appear on earlier Chickasaw rolls or rosters. And that's most unfortunate because Chickasaw freedmen really had a lot of struggles. They were not treated very well for many years. Um, there was just, and if you read, I don't happen to have it close by, I thought I did, Daniel Littlefield's book on the Chickasaw freedmen and realize how they struggled all the way up to statehood when they finally became citizens of the United States. But Chickasaws are the ones who will have no prior enrollment or documentation before that time. You also find, however, on those cards, significant notes that can refer you to other things. And occasionally, and this is important, occasionally you'll find where some were fighting their placement on the freedman roll. They resisted and they really spoke up for themselves and said, wait a minute, I shouldn't be on this roll, and here's why. I should be on a roll by blood. And they knew specifically what they were doing because in particularly both Choctaw and Chickasaw Nation, if you're put on the freedman roll, you receive 40 acres of land. But if you were put on a roll by blood or intermarried white, you would receive 8 times as much, 320 acres. So they were given 1/8 of the pie, while others who were not of African descent received 8 times more. And that's really something to consider. But nevertheless, as a genealogist, you can still find significant data. Creek Freedman, I've already mentioned the structure of the towns. You can see in this particular case, Peter Stidham, he was on an Arkansas town roll of 1890, tells you what year the roll was recorded, tells you the page number. In this case, you can see where someone wrote it by hand, page number 26. And you get to that page and you'll see his name. But also, what's significant, you see another notation that he was also on the Dunn roll. And he was not on the Dunn roll as Peter Stidham. He was on the Don roll, as it says, as Peter Corbin, and it tells you line number or roll number 572. And the Don roll is significant because it was recorded in the 1860s after slavery was abolished, after the treaty was signed. So it's very, very significant in that case. Seminole Freedmen, I made a reference to them a minute ago. Their structure is a structure of bands, tribal bands. And there are multiple bands, but there are two freedmen bands in particular, the Doser Barkas Band and the Caesar Bruner Band. In this particular case, Titus Cudjoe was on a roll of members in 1897 who are part of the Doser Barkers Band. Others you will find who are on the Caesar Bruner Band. And it'll tell you what particular year. That would be the year that they used to reference to confirm that this person had a tie to the nation. And of course, you find the other information there, who the slaveholder was, their roll number, if there's significant notes. You see that in this case, the second person, Cora, who was the daughter, she died in August of 1903. So you want to look at every detail. But then But go to the back side. There's more. There's far more information. Going back to Stick Ross again, we see all of that good information on the front. And on the back, we see his father, Hector Ross. His father had been a part of Tahlequah District. His father, slaveholder John Ross. His mother was Sally. Sally was also enslaved by John Ross. But we also see information about his wife and who her parents were. Johnson Rowe was her father. Edna Rowe was her mother. They had been enslaved by David Rowe in the Saline district in the Cherokee Nation. So again, you find other information. And so you want to, of course, to look at that in particular. The parents, the slaveholder of the parents, tribal enrollment of the parents. Also, very, very important and very significant data to find. Also, if the parent was deceased or not. If you do not see that column and where they have filled out the word dead or DEC or the letter D indicating the person is deceased, that's telling you that maybe that parent is still alive and that parent will have a card as well. So it is important to pay attention to every single detail. And many had native fathers. In this particular case, you're looking at my ancestors, Sam and Sally Walton. On the back side, you see information there. And look where it says father's owner. The father did not have an owner because the father, in this case, was a Choctaw Indian. So you want to look for that information as well because it can point you to other records and other things about the family and its history. Here's another case. Many of you have probably heard the case of Betty Ligon. She, of course, was the head litigant in Equity Case 7071. And many people know that, of course, she was Choctaw on the records, but her father was an individual who was Chickasaw. Now you might look and say, wait a minute, I thought you said Chickasaw freedmen did not have that data filled out. They did not. Look at the top. She was Choctaw. She had been placed on a roll earlier and was living in the Chickasaw Nation, but she was Choctaw freedmen. So she was placed on a Choctaw record. And of course, many were put on the 1896 roll. Hers was actually an 1898 roll. And guess what? You see those numbers to the right. It tells you number 186, 188, 189, 190, etc. It tells you where to find her name. It points you to this record. And if you look closely to the left, you'll see right in the middle, there's Betty Ligon. You see everyone else in the household as well. And to the left of her name, you'll see those numbers 186, 187, 188, 189. They correspond to those numbers that were written on the front of her enrollment card. So every piece of data that's written on those cards is important. You want to look at that information because it's pointing you to something else. Also, you find that other tribes besides Choctaw or Chickasaw nations also reflected earlier roles, earlier town roles. Here's a case of George Sugar. Some people know as Sugar George. And you'll see in his case who his slaveholder was, but you also see he was on an 1890 roll from North Fork Town. You see his wife, Betsy Sugar. She was from Canadian Town. Both of those two towns were freedmen towns. And in fact, Sugar George was actually at one point a representative of North Fork, Colored Town, as it's sometimes called, and he served as town king, meaning he served in one, well, actually, he served in both ruling houses in the tribal government structure. He was in the House of Warriors and the House of Kings as well. And of course, as town king, I guess equivalent to mayor, but he served in those offices. And of course, you see his previous enrollment. It also tells you what page to find his name on the 1890 Town Roll of North Fork, Colored Town. Also, one more thing you'll see at the bottom, you see those notes in the middle where it says number 1 on DR as Sugar Harrod, number 17. That's referring to the Dunn roll. And the Dunn roll was recorded in 1867. So it's pointing you to a much earlier record. In the Seminole Nation, I referred to the bands, the Doser Barkus Band, as you can see in the case of Diana Dennis and her family, her children, you'll see that they were all part of the same band, the Doser Barkus Band. The other information is similar to other tribes, slaveholder, etc. But in the Seminole Nation, it's one of two bands. Now, here is an interesting an exception. We're looking at Edmund rather, Homedy. And in this particular case, you see the information that's there. Of course, it's blank, all that information that is there. But you do get additional information. You see, for example, first of all, Lydia, his mother, is still alive. She's not deceased. So that's going to tell you, wow, you can get more information about her as well. So even though there might not be tribal enrollment, but you find other information, it's always an exception when you see that one of the parents is still alive and you can find more information about her. Now, of course, as we look closely, Tom, her father, was deceased, but her mother was alive and well. And so you know to go and find the mother's card. So summing all of this up, look at all the components on the DOS card. It's just not the name and a roll number. You'll get the date of the application, the name of the enrollee, their roll number, yes, but their tribal enrollment number you get, relationship to others in the household, the name of the slaveholder for those who had been enslaved, the names of the parents of every enrollee that's there, the life status of the parent, whether they were alive or deceased, the tribal band or tribal town, Indian parents, if the parent was not a person who was a free person, and if they were a member of the tribe, that information is there on those cards, and detailed notes that pertain to the family. You want to get into those enrollment cards. And one thing I would suggest doing, don't just look at that one card and, okay, I got my family's data. You know what? Look at the pages that come before. Look at the previous cards. Look at the pages that follow, the cards that follow in numerical sequence of the cards where your ancestors were. You will find so many more people who lived in the same community, used the same post office. You will start to be able to construct the community. Anyway, I hope this has been helpful, and do hope that you'll be able to take some of this information with you and apply it to your own research. And just keep in mind that the enrollment cards that you use, regardless of whatever tribe that they're from, they're just the beginning of the records from the era of the Dawes Commission. But these cards can open the doors that are going to reveal so much more about your family's history. So I encourage you to really get up close and personal with these cards. And when you present your family story, Tell everything. Talk about the fact that, yes, in 1880, they were on this roll of authenticated freedmen. And as much as you can, because that's what's going to make it interesting. And that's what people are going to start to remember. And from all of these elements and contents of these cards, it's from these pieces of information from which your story is going to come. Anyway, I certainly thank you for watching. If you're interested in reading more about other families, certainly you are invited to get your own copies of Freedmen of the Frontier, Volumes 1 and Volume 2. They're now available on Amazon. And if you'd like to connect to other researchers, consider being a part of the Oklahoma Freedmen Collective. We educate descendants, we empower descendants, and we create avenues of communication for descendants or descendant groups. So I certainly hope that you will join us. And I hope this has been really helpful for you. And I thank you for your time, and I will see you next time. Take care, everyone. Bye bye.